Think Game of Thrones was brutal, actual medieval politics made the red wedding look like a family dinner. Real rulers backstabbed, married off children for alliances, and sent assassins in the night, and that was just Monday. You're about to find out how Europe's real-life power games were even messier, deadlier, and more twisted than anything HBO dreamed up. Trust me, you'll never look at your favorite characters the same way again. You think awkward family weddings are bad? Try having an entire kingdom show up, not to dance or eat cake, but to split up land and decide who runs the army. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about falling in love or finding your soulmate. It was the ultimate power play. If your parents could score the right marriage deal, suddenly your family owned a few more castles, or could call on 100 extra knights. If they picked the wrong side, you might end up in a dark tower, conveniently forgotten. Most people today picture medieval weddings as romantic, maybe with a few flower petals, a swooning princess, and some slow music. Take that idea, toss it out the nearest arrow slit, and you're closer to the real story. Marriage among nobles was all about trading lands, armies, and even crowns. Imagine being 12 years old, not even through puberty, and you've already got your future mapped out. Stand at the altar, recite some vows to a stranger you met 2 hours ago, and hope your father's enemies aren't waiting behind the curtain with a knife. Let's really talk about what went on here. We can't talk about ruthless marriage deals without mentioning Eleanor of Aquitaine. She didn't just marry up, she moved political mountains. First, she wed the French king, making her Queen of France. Later, she got that marriage annulled and married the future King of England, Henry II. Nobody's ever accused her of thinking small. With Eleanor came a huge chunk of territory, basically half of modern France. Suddenly, all the nobles had to redo their battle plans because of one woman's wedding reception. Imagine the outrage Pinterest would see if they covered that party. Now, if you're still thinking that queens were just sitting around brushing their hair, enter Isabella of France. She was shipped off to England at the ripe age of 12 to marry Edward II, and she quickly realized her Prince Charming was anything but charming. Turns out, Isabella had a mind for politics and revenge. She joined up with a rebel, launched an invasion, and overthrew her own husband. That's not exactly a love story, unless you define love as helping end a king's reign and taking charge yourself. If you ever feel awkward about your in-laws, at least they probably haven't led an army against you. Now, why did these marriages matter so much? Recent studies show that before the 1600s, about 90% of royal marriages in Europe were arranged for political advantage, not because someone felt butterflies. Every ceremony was a strategic act. Marry a rival's son, and suddenly, you're not fighting a war next spring. Promise your daughter to the duke next door, and you might just avoid having your castle burned down next winter. Kings and queens didn't date, they negotiated. But here's the brutal underbelly. Some alliances started with fancy parties and ended with poison at dinner. If you were unlucky, you found out that your husband's family wasn't as welcoming as they seemed. The marriage contract might promise you 5 castles and a royal title, but if the political wind changed, those same in-laws might slip something extra into your wine. Poison was just another tool in the kit. Less bloody than war, but just as effective. Not that war was off the table. Plenty of marriages started peace and ended with generational blood feuds. Take the House of Valois and the House of Plantagenet. Their tangled family trees, joined and broken by marriages, were a big reason for the 100 Years' War, which, spoiler, didn't actually last exactly 100 years. Thanks to these family brawls, entire regions spent decades on fire, fields turned to mud, and towns were wiped away. If you think your family holiday arguments drag on, imagine one that involves archers and siege engines. So, would you want to be a medieval parent? Well, good luck. Marriage was like chess, except your pieces were your own kids, and every move could mean a new ally or a fresh enemy. Mothers and fathers made these choices, hoping to keep their bloodline on the right side of power. There were no do-overs. If you played poorly, your children could end up locked in a tower or shipped off as political hostages, sometimes both, just for good measure. Fancy baby photos? Not so much. More like sending out portraits to distant courts and hoping someone with a spare duchy would bite. The families that won weren't just lucky, they understood the game. They married up, married often, married smart. The real winners didn't care much about love or romance. They wanted more land, more troops, and direct lines to the biggest crowns. The people who got left behind, often the ones who still believed in fairy tales or worse, trusted a rival family, who just happened to have a tall, drafty castle available. Not even religious vows were safe from politics. Medieval Europe's church had rules about marriage, but if a lord or king wanted out of a marriage, he'd usually find a priest willing to bend those rules for the right price or threat. Annulments, secret second weddings, and all sorts of scandals followed. The church preached about the sanctity of marriage on Sunday, then blessed a king as he handed his old wife a passport and a nunnery on Monday. Women in this game could be both pawns and players. Some, like Eleanor, wrote their own rules. Others endured forced marriages, endless childbirth, and saw their children used as bargaining chips in the next political round. Queens and princesses lived with the constant threat that today's alliance might turn deadly by the next feast. Behind the scenes, marriage contracts were full of hidden clauses. Who kept which castle? What happened if you didn't have children? Was the dowry paid in gold or in grain? Nobles argued over every promise. If something went wrong, a childless marriage, a lost battle, or an insult at court, the squabbles that followed could last for generations. And kids didn't escape this mess, either. While 10-year-olds today worry about video game high scores, their medieval counterparts worried about getting shipped off to foreign courts or being pledged to someone twice their age. Some girls got sent to convents for safekeeping until the next marriage deal came through. Boys could wake up in one country and end up on another continent, all for the family strategy. Forget wedding cakes and honeymoon trips. In medieval Europe, newly married couples often spent their first days apart, handling affairs back at home or waiting for word that a key alliance was secure. Even the meaning of marriage was slippery. A bond according to some, a legal contract according to others, and a military alliance to anyone holding a sword. So, next time someone tells you medieval marriage was about romance, you'll know better. This was a battlefield where every vow came with a price, and sometimes that price was measured in blood, not gold. The opening move was the wedding ceremony, but the endgame could be decades of plots, betrayals, or even open war. That's why, for all the talk of honor and chivalry, the people who survived were the ones who treated marriage as the politest form of warfare. There were winners, there were losers, and there were plenty of happily ever afters that ended with a mysterious illness. Forget fairy tales. Marriage in medieval Europe was all about who walked away with more power and who was left signing another alliance at sword point. Now, if you think that sounds dangerous, wait until you hear how little anyone actually trusted each other. Feudal loyalty? Let's just say, it was usually a race to betray first. Ever notice how feudal lords in Game of Thrones switch sides as fast as they swap banners? Well, real medieval nobles would have put those fictional families to shame. Loyalty in medieval Europe wasn't something you carved in stone. It was more like something you wrote down in chalk and then waited to see if it would wash away with the next rainstorm. Sure, everyone made big speeches about honor and oaths, but in reality, those oaths only meant something if you were physically holding the keys to a rival's castle, or you had enough knights standing behind you to make sure your friend stayed friendly. Imagine living in a world where a handshake promised everything, but a sword in the ribs settled most arguments. Nobles were expected to swear loyalty to their king, but self-interest always came first. If another lord offered more land or a better shot at the throne, you're unbreakable. Words suddenly became a little less permanent. The only thing more fragile than a sworn oath was the actual peace that was supposed to depend on it. In many cases, your neighbor's promise not to burn down your village was only good until someone else gave him a fatter purse or a prettier castle. Let's not pretend this idea of betrayal was subtle or hidden. During the 100 Years' War, a drag-out mess that spanned more than a century, nobles on both sides switched allegiances like they changed their socks. One day a French lord might be feasting with the English and waving their flag. A few months later, he could be leading an attack on his allies because the king on the other side promised him more gold. Whole regions bounced back and forth across enemy lines based on who was in charge, who had the bigger army, and who looked more likely to win this week. Everyone involved knew the game. If you were a king, you spent a lot less time sleeping than you'd like. Historical records show betrayals were so common that kings posted spies, even inside their own councils. You'd sit down at a big wooden table for dinner, and there would always be a chance that half the people serving food had their real loyalty somewhere else. You couldn't let your guard down for a minute, and you definitely didn't share your dinner plans or your bedroom location with just anyone. Some monarchs even went so far as to deliberately plant misinformation in front of certain trusted counselors just to find out who would leak it to the other camp. The real challenge wasn't just keeping enemies at bay. You had to keep your allies from turning into enemies overnight, which was sometimes tougher. Nobles didn't just want a thank you note or a pat on the back. They wanted lands, titles, castles, maybe a sack or two of gold on the side, and definitely the freedom to turn coat if someone offered them an even better deal. Sometimes a king would pile titles, land grants, and honors on a lord, only to watch him march off the next morning with the opposition anyway. The whole feudal system looked steady on the outside, a neat pyramid of lords, knights, vassals, and servants. But underneath, it was more like stacking sticks and hoping no one sneezed. Everyone on top knew just how easily the whole mess could collapse with one broken promise or one greedy noble who lost his nerve in a siege. Every single person with power kept a mental list of who could be trusted, and it was a short list. Most of the time, it didn't have any names on it at all. You'd think that constant suspicion would slow things down, right? Not really. If anything, it sped up the plotting. Kings scrambled to shore up their alliances with gifts and more oaths, but real loyalty was almost a superstition. There are actual case studies showing that civil wars, which should have been rare since so much effort went into making peace treaties, almost always kicked off because someone broke an oath, sided with the wrong cousin, or just lost their nerve and bailed. One forgotten promise could trigger a conflict that swallowed whole countries. And don't get the idea that this was just a problem for kings far away from the action. Even minor nobles had to watch their backs. The pyramid of promises wasn't just about the big guys. Local barons and minor knights also made deals, broke them, and then sometimes paid the price with their heads, or their land going up in flames. If you had a neighbor with enough men to storm your tiny castle, your best bet was to pretend friendship until you could cut a better deal with someone stronger. Everyone lived in a climate where treachery was the default, not the exception. Kings and nobles kept busy inventing new ways to test their allies. Some would host big feasts, not just to celebrate, but to watch who talked to whom, or who seemed a little too friendly with a rival house. Others built complicated webs of marriages, just to make sure a family member was on every major council. Never mind if those family members were actually hostages dressed up in fancy clothes. The line between guest and prisoner was as thin as a flag in the wind. Even those at the bottom of the totem pole watched these shifts with both excitement and fear. If the top of the pyramid shook, everyone below felt the tremors. Farmers and merchants could wake up to find their new lord was the same man who'd attacked the village last year. Promises trickled down, or didn't, so your safety as a regular person depended on which noble was currently holding the paper-thin leash in your area. Sometimes villages changed lords 3 or 4 times in a single decade, each time learning a new set of rules and hoping the taxes stayed the same. The upside of all this chaos was that, every now and then, a clever or ruthless operator could score big. If you saw an alliance crumbling, you might slip in, offer your services, and walk away with a new title or a chunk of land. The downside, of course, was that if you gambled and backed the wrong lord, you'd find yourself evicted, imprisoned, or much worse, often with your family dragged down into your mess. Even marriage alliances, powerful as they were, couldn't totally lock people into the right side. Merovingian rulers in the 6th century, for instance, aimed for prestige and power, not friendship or loyalty. Their deals weren't about building lasting peace. They were about making sure everyone knew who held the most glittering title this week. Marriages to members of other royal families were a way to emphasize their royal status and garner support. And as much as these unions could bring short-term victory, they didn't mean anyone was locked in for the long haul. If someone richer or more important came knocking, loyalties changed with the wind. So when you hear about great medieval alliances and oaths of fealty, remember that every promise was also a negotiation. And often, trust was so rare it was practically a kind of currency, traded, bargained over, and usually in short supply. Betrayal wasn't a disaster. It was the default setting. If you forgot that, you didn't last long. Now, as if that wasn't dangerous enough, the political game also had real-life hitmen who handled business a little more directly. Medieval assassins weren't content with backroom deals. They took care of rivals out in the open. Want to see how medieval Europe invented its own version of silent killers? Let's get into that world of shadows next. Think Game of Thrones invented the idea of assassins lurking in the shadows? Real medieval assassins made all that look gentle by comparison. You know those faceless men in the show who hide, wait, and then vanish into the night. Turns out, history had its own version, and they rarely bothered with magic disguises or dramatic reveals. Mixing patience, training, and total nerve, these killers would blend in, wait weeks or even months, and strike exactly when it mattered most. But instead of being lone wolves on a solo mission, the most famous assassins in medieval history operated like a deadly club with a cause, and a playbook straight out of a spy thriller. Let's talk about the Nizari Ismailis, a group so notorious for their deadly tactics that their enemies gave them the name assassins. There's some debate about where the word actually comes from. A lot of their enemies claimed it meant users of hashish, painting a picture of out-of-control fanatics, but some researchers argue it's more likely twisted from Assassinian, which basically means people who are faithful to the Aziz, referring to their beliefs. Either way, pretty much nobody wanted to get on their bad side. They built their fortress state in Persia in the 11th century, led by Hassan I Sabah, who basically combined the job description of cult leader, army general, and secret agent boss. Imagine a society where loyalty to your cause meant training every day, learning languages, blending into different crowds, and nodding along even if you were surrounded by people who'd like to see your head separated from your body. The Nizari's most trusted agents were called the Feudal, the self-sacrificing ones. Becoming a Feudal wasn't some short boot camp. It was a deep process. They went through intense physical and mental training, studying not just religion but also how to act, walk, and sound like they belonged wherever they went. They needed to fool guards, mingle at crowded markets, and sometimes get close to kings and viziers before pulling out a dagger at the right moment. These Feudals weren't just about blending in. They were prepared to give up everything for their mission. Rather than slip poison into a cup and hope for the best, the Feudals walked straight up and finished the job face to face. And their favorite weapon? The jambia, a short, curved dagger you could hide but also draw quickly. It wasn't about making things look like accidents or covering your tracks. It was about sending a message, loud and clear, with the blade itself. You might think that made it easy to catch them, but the shock and awe was exactly the point. Now, a lot of people imagine assassins as mysterious and working alone, maybe hiding out in candlelit rooms, whispering with fellow conspirators. But the real-life Nizari Ismailis made assassination something like a military specialty. They picked their targets with care: kings who threatened their existence, viziers plotting a crackdown, even crusader leaders who pushed too far into the wrong territory. If you held real power in the region and found yourself looking over your shoulder more than usual, there was a chance the Nizaris were interested in you. Their fortress at Alamut, which they called home base, wasn't just some isolated castle on a hill. It was a center of learning, a place for planning, and, according to travelers, as hard to invade as it was to bribe them into peace. Some historians call Alamut the epicenter of the Nizari state, a military, intellectual, and spiritual hub. The group didn't just stab random nobles, either. Their assassinations were chosen for maximum impact. The killing of high officials, crusader commanders, even the powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk and Conrad of Montferrat, one of the last big players in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, sent waves of fear through every royal hall from Cairo to Constantinople. These were major figures, killed not in secrecy, but in public, with witnesses left to spread the fear. If you were the target, you wouldn't be safe in your own palace. And even if you weren't on their list, you got the message. Cross these people, and you might never sleep soundly again. Chronicles and old letters show rulers went to wild lengths to protect themselves from assassination. Some didn't even sleep in the same room twice, in a row. One day you'd get up in bedchambers on the east wall, the next you'd be in a storeroom, hiding behind barrels, just to make sure nobody working for the assassins could guess where you were. Whole palaces were redesigned with trapdoors and twisting hallways, all just to make it harder for a single man with a dagger to get in close. The assassins inspired a level of anxiety no royal guard could really fix. What made them so feared wasn't just their secrecy, it was the way they did business. These weren't your run-of-the-mill poisoners or sneaky cutthroats. They often attacked in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, sometimes at religious festivals or public squares. Their message wasn't only for the victim. It was for everyone watching. Imagine a world where political leaders weren't just afraid of war or open rebellion. They were terrified to step outside or shake hands in public, because someone might be hiding a blade behind a smile. On top of that, the Nizari Ismailis didn't go after just anyone. Their campaigns were strategic. They saved their efforts for moments that would destabilize their biggest enemies or protect their own vulnerable communities. Killing a leader at just the right time could change the course of a war or throw a rival kingdom into chaos for months. They turned assassination into a strange blend of military precision, religious devotion, and political theater. Another twist is that the myth and fear around the assassins grew so big, people started seeing their hand everywhere, even when they weren't involved. Dying unexpectedly? Must have been the assassins. Your vizier skipped town after an argument with the Ismailis? Obviously, he was marked for the dagger. Their reputation alone could push rivals to change plans or abandon their ambitions, showing that the threat of assassination could be just as effective as the act itself. One old chronicler described the effect. Their actions had a profound impact on the course of Middle Eastern history, influencing regional powers and prompting shifts in strategies and alliances. By focusing on only the most important targets, the assassins kept their enemies constantly guessing. One public strike could push an entire enemy court into lockdown. Sometimes, the aftermath of one killing echoed for years, disrupting trade, changing the rulers, or even preventing another crusader campaign. The ability to quietly topple or scare off a critical threat made these assassins a force that big armies had to take into account. So, if you thought Game of Thrones had chilling murder scenes, the real Middle Ages had far more pointed and public reminders that power came with a target painted on your back. Assassination in this world wasn't about being sneaky for the sake of mystery. It was a very direct way of saying, we see you, we can reach you, and nobody's untouchable. Every ruler got the memo, whether they liked it or not. And the next time someone claims the only people playing politics were kings, they probably never read what queens and churchmen got up to. The real power games weren't just played with daggers. They happened with prayers, treaties, and a lot of behind-the-scenes scheming. You've probably heard stories where medieval kings ran the show, calling the shots, making all the big decisions, and standing at the center of power. In reality, the story barely starts there. The real magic was happening at the edges, where queens and priests worked in the shadows, often guiding or even completely reworking the king's plans from behind closed doors. If you were keeping your eyes locked on the throne, you missed the hands quietly tugging the strings behind the tapestry. Let's talk about the kind of power that hid in plain sight. Imagine all eyes glued to the king's big speech, while a queen slipped a note to a courtier or a bishop whispered in the right ear. The loudest voices got the attention, but serious players knew whose advice the king took behind the scenes mattered more. For every king, there were at least 2 people nearby who could ruin his week or flip his fortunes just by tilting the scales at the right moment. This was especially true if they wore a veil or carried a bishop's staff. All those royal courts full of men in armor, half of them worried more about a queen's sly suggestion or a bishop's subtle frown than the weight of their own sword. People loved to say women and priests had to play by different rules. Less visible, more limited. But if you look at the chessboard, the most creative moves always started on the outside. Matilda of Tuscany, for example, wasn't content to sit in a corner and needlepoint while the men fought it out for power. She put on armor, led armies herself, and shaped the outcome of one of the biggest political showdowns of the Middle Ages, the investiture controversy. This was not just a family spat. It was an all-out fight over who got to crown emperors, decide bishops, and basically own the spiritual keys to Europe. Matilda sided with the Pope against the Holy Roman Emperor, backed her convictions with swords, and played a deciding role in whether the Church or the Emperor truly ruled Italy. If you think medieval women stayed behind the scenes, Matilda would happily contradict you, preferably by parading through the battlefield on horseback. Meanwhile, the Church was quietly stacking up wins of its own. People often picture monks chanting in dark churches, but the Church's influence stretched way further than Sunday sermons. If you controlled acres of land across every kingdom, with entire farms, villages, and even forests paying you tribute, you didn't need to swing a sword to be powerful. The magic of the medieval church rested on more than faith. It owned some of the best real estate in Europe, managed enormous sums of money, and had the exclusive right to decide who wore the crown, literally and figuratively. Crowning a king was a religious act, and if a church official refused to bless the coronation, suddenly, that shiny new crown meant a lot less. Even with armies and land, medieval kings had to keep the church happy or risk losing everything, sometimes overnight. Church officials could make or break rulers with a single excommunication. Getting excommunicated wasn't just a spiritual slap on the wrist, it was a disaster. Your allies started to desert you, enemies circled, and your own people questioned your right to rule. If the Pope or a powerful bishop thought you'd overstepped, your supporters could turn cold faster than a stone cathedral in winter. Plenty of kings ended up on their knees, literally, begging church authorities for forgiveness, just so they could get their crown back and keep their subjects in line. You probably wouldn't guess it, but some of the most famous political standoffs happened because a churchman refused to back down from a king. Take Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Originally a close friend of King Henry II, Becket refused to put royal interest above the church, even with threats and intimidation swirling. The tension grew until it finally snapped. Becket's murder at the hands of the king's knights shocked all of Europe. Instead of weakening the church, the act turned Becket into a martyr and forced the king into public humiliation and penance. One stubborn priest held up all of English politics, reshaped royal power, and became a rallying point for anyone ready to question the king's authority. The church didn't stop there. Its officials could bend the law, arrange peace talks, and bankroll rebellions, all without ever picking up a sword. When disputes over land or succession broke out, church courts often had the final word. And if you didn't like the answer you got, good luck. Resisting meant risking your soul, your lands, and probably your head. On top of that, bishops doubled as landlords and bankers, collecting taxes and funding whole armies. Whether you were a king, local lord, or wandering knight, you wanted a friendly face in the monastery, just in case. Let's turn the spotlight back to queens for a second, because they were the masters of the long game. Think queens just smiled, looked regal, and waited for someone to hand them a bouquet? Think again. They were the masters of forming alliances, managing enormous estates, and in many cases, running the show while their husbands rode around playing war. Recent studies prove it wasn't just about sitting on a throne. It meant acting as regent, ruling entire kingdoms, and negotiating treaties. Queens in medieval Europe were not merely ornamental figures. They were often deeply involved in arranging alliances, managing estates, and sometimes even governing in their husband's absence. You've heard about Eleanor of Aquitaine, but pause for a second and really consider her role. This is a queen who married 2 kings, helped organize multiple coups, and spent more time running things than most men of her era. She picked sides, moved armies, and made decisions that helped redraw the map of Western Europe more than once. Their influence was anything but soft. Queens could plot against rivals, handle international diplomacy, or gather support for their children's claims if a king died. Sometimes this meant stepping in as ruler when the official king was a child, away fighting, or just outmatched by court politics. Others acted as the real head of the household, enforcing discipline, settling disputes, and handing out rewards to loyal servants, making sure everyone knew who quietly held the purse strings and the real family secrets. It wasn't all just strategy and paperwork. The stakes were real, often life or death, for anyone playing at this level. Some queens became famous for their plotting, others for their reforms. Still others saw power slip through their hands and ended up in convents or exile, banished by new schemes. But the question was never if they played the game, only how well. The ones who lasted weren't just lucky. They were sharp, adaptable, and willing to risk everything to keep the family legacy alive. What made someone truly successful in these circles wasn't brute strength, but timing and subtlety. The real winner wasn't always the guy waving a sword. It was often the clever woman who picked the right moment to whisper advice, or the bishop who made sure the king's enemies had an easy path to Rome. The best players understood the web of invisible threads holding the court together, and knew exactly when to pull the most important ones. Alliances were rewired, deals collapsed, and families either rose to new heights or lost everything based on a nod from a queen or a few lines of Latin from a churchman. If you ever thought medieval politics was a one-person show, you missed half the story. Power in this world was a team sport, and the smartest teams weren't afraid to change the rules. The next time someone says only kings mattered, ask them which queen outmaneuvered her husband that year, or which bishop rewrote the law when the king looked away. And as all these forces built up, every small maneuver brought Europe closer to a full-blown eruption. Succession crises that didn't just threaten family dinners, but turned whole countries upside down. What happens when the king dies, and suddenly everyone thinks they have a claim to the crown? Imagine a kingdom where, before the king's body is even cold, every nephew, cousin, and half-forgotten in-law is dusting off old family trees, waving bits of paper and rallying troops. It wasn't just a royal family squabble. Succession crises in medieval Europe were like dropping a match in a room full of gunpowder. The moment word got out that the king was gone, every major noble started sharpening their swords and brushing up on their family connections. Picture what that actually meant for a kingdom. If the rules were clear and everyone accepted them, maybe you'd just get a new ruler and move on. But that's not how it worked. Feudal laws were a mess, with customs mixing up who had the strongest claim. In some places, it was supposed to go to the oldest son. In others, the nobles picked their favorite. Then add in a sudden death without a clear heir or a king who hadn't made things obvious, and you got a situation primed for chaos. The result? The lack of a clear and universally accepted system of succession was a major source of instability. Different regions and kingdoms had their own customs, ranging from primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, to elective monarchies. These variations created opportunities for disputes and power struggles, especially when a king died without a clear heir or when multiple claimants vied for the throne. The War of the Roses in England is the poster child for this kind of disaster. In the 15th century, the houses of Lancaster and York, both with blood ties to the royal plant, became locked in a back-and-forth slugfest. Cousins turned on cousins, nephews fought uncles, and the crown bounced back and forth so many times you'd swear it was caught in a windstorm. People like to think family reunions are awkward, but nobody's awkwardness ever ended with armies clashing outside London and heads rolling into baskets. The ambiguity of feudal laws provided ample justification for the bloodshed. That basically means any half-plausible claim was enough for someone to raise an army, loot the countryside, and call it destiny. Now, it wasn't just England. France, Spain, even tiny principalities across Europe dealt with the same risks. Take the Capetian dynasty in France. At first, the Capetians had to work extra hard to keep the throne from slipping away to ambitious nobles, but there was usually someone eyeing the crown and plotting. They fought tooth and nail, using every trick in the medieval playbook: smart marriages, close ties with the church, and, when required, armies on the move. The absence of any real, agreed-on rulebook meant that every succession was basically up for debate. Lawyers, yes, even back then, would dig into dusty scrolls. Priests would argue doctrine, and nobles would point to some long-dead ancestor. With so many loopholes, you could almost always find a reason to say, "No, actually, it's my turn on the throne." These conflicts were not mere family squabbles, but full-blown wars, with armies clashing, cities besieged, and the lives of commoners upended. A king's death automatically brought a surge in political jockeying. All the ambitious nobles, especially those who'd been quiet while the king was strong, suddenly spoke up. The power vacuum that ambitious nobles and rival claimants were eager to fill meant that every region risked descending into war. These claimants didn't just argue in royal halls. They raised armies, built alliances, and took their disputes to open battlefields. Each thought if they won, they'd wear the crown, but more often than not, the fight lasted way longer than anyone imagined. Historical records are packed with examples of these disputes dragging out for decades. The War of the Roses ran roughly 30 years, leaving England nearly unrecognizable, and everyone in the country exhausted. Smaller kingdoms weren't immune either. Some saw wars stretch on so long that entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. Historical records reveal that some succession disputes lasted decades, dragging in neighboring kingdoms and leaving whole regions in chaos. Neighboring countries weren't shy about jumping in either. If you saw a chance to grab some land or put your cousin on the throne in another kingdom, what ruler could resist? These weren't rare exceptions. Civil wars in medieval Europe were almost expected whenever a king started looking frail. The prospect of inheriting territory, instead of buying it or conquering it slowly, was too tempting to pass up. The only real guarantee was that no one could ever feel comfortable about the future. Civil wars weren't rare. They were almost expected whenever a king looked a little too frail. It became part of the rhythm of medieval life. Strong king, uneasy peace. King dies, all bets off. If you think the damage stayed up at the high levels, think again. Ordinary people consistently paid the price. Armies moving from city to city burned crops, took livestock, and drove villagers out. Towns that happened to sit between two claimants could see their homes leveled one year by one army and the next by their enemies. The impact of these succession disputes and civil wars on society was catastrophic. Ordinary people, the vast majority of the population, bore the brunt of the conflict. Fields were ruined, crops destroyed, and villages were often abandoned or razed. No matter who technically won, survivors often found themselves starting from scratch, living in ruins, or packing up and moving somewhere safer. People didn't just lose their houses. Trade stopped, trade routes closed, and money dried up. These conflicts often disrupted trade, caused widespread famine, and led to the breakdown of social order. Families lost everything they'd built across generations, because the men at the top couldn't agree on a name for the winner. Sometimes, famine followed the fighting when there weren't enough farmers left to plant crops. Other times, new diseases spread as armies marched and people crowded into safer cities. The church played its own sly game in these crises. While bishops and abbots tried to act above the noise, they often picked favorites. The church could legitimize a claimant, provide moral support, or even excommunicate a rival. A bit of holy approval or a dramatic excommunication shaped who people backed. Religious leaders' support was seen as divine proof of a ruler's right to wear the crown, and plenty of claimants owed their thrones as much to a bishop's blessing as to a sword. But the most critical role in these bloody games fell to powerful nobles. With their own armies, networks, and tons of land, these local lords made or broke kings by choosing which banner to follow. The role of powerful nobles in succession crises was often crucial. These individuals, with their own armies, lands, and influence, could either support a claimant or challenge them. With one letter or oath, they could tilt the whole contest, or at least force it to start up all over again next year. So what was it really about? Forget glory, or all the scenes with kings standing on glimmering thrones. The real medieval Game of Thrones was survival, pure and simple. The person who outlasted the rest got to call themselves king or queen, at least until the next disaster. In the meantime, there was never a day when anyone really felt safe. And if you wonder how anyone managed to survive in this web of plots and promise-breaking, just wait, because wild alliances and sudden betrayals made everything even more unpredictable. Think you could keep track of medieval alliances? Good luck with that. In reality, if you asked a medieval ruler who their allies were, you'd probably get a nervous laugh and a quick glance over the shoulder. Nothing stuck, not even loyalty sealed with blood or prayers. One week's trusted friend turned rival by Sunday, and nobody kept the same list of enemies for long. Alliances moved faster than the weather, and every ruler had to play along or risk being left out in the cold, or worse, at the business end of a sword. Behind every handshake, in those smoky halls, was a secret plan. Nobody stepped into a treaty expecting it to last forever. You made your promises, smiled for the crowd, maybe even tossed in an embrace in front of the nobles, but the ink was barely dry before everyone started thinking up exit strategies. Kings and dukes both knew. Every treaty might as well have been written in invisible ink, and it could vanish the moment a better deal came along. Especially in places like the Italian city-states, alliances didn't just blur, they evaporated. Florence and Milan, Venice and Genoa, they made up, split up, double-crossed, and then sat down at the same table the next year as if nothing happened. Yesterday's best friend stood across the battlefield tomorrow, aiming crossbows at former drinking buddies. This wasn't just a problem in Italy. The whole map played the same game if you looked close enough. France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, they all tangled in the same knots. One day England and Burgundy would scheme against France. Then Burgundy would switch to the French side. Then France would send gold to Scotland to annoy the English, and around it would go. Nobody expected these deals to last. If the maps could talk, they'd sound like a kid arguing with himself during a board game. The chaos made a mess of who had any real control. Monarchs needed all their senses just to survive, since alliances were as fleeting as the promises made to forge them. Archaeological digs have found destroyed seals from old treaties tossed in wells, showing just how quickly documents and friendships could become trash. Old letters are even juicier. Nobles obsessively wrote to their spies and informants, begging for updates on who is cozying up to whom this week. Rulers hired whole teams of secret messengers, just to find out who was promising what behind the walls of stone castles. It was common for a king to discover at breakfast that his favorite ally had actually signed a secret agreement with his enemy, sometimes at the same banquet. Now, people today complain about politicians dodging questions and making vague promises, but medieval leaders turned this into an art form. The very magic of medieval politics was making promises you never actually planned to keep, and hoping the person on the other end didn't realize it too quickly. You could promise support, write up a dazzling treaty, and then, at the first scent of a better offer, change sides without warning. For some, the only reason to join an alliance was to find out enough secrets to destroy it from the inside. Imagine a world where even your most sincere cheer looked like a threat waiting for its moment. The Italian city-states perfected the fast-flip friendship model. Let's talk about Florence. In the morning, the city council would hold ceremonies and public meetings, swearing undying support to Pisa. By afternoon, if they caught wind of a better offer from Milan, they'd break the peace before sundown and send an ambassador with a gift basket across the mountain passes. Venice, the ultimate survivor, practically wrote the textbook on playing enemies off each other. The rule of thumb? Trust no one. And if you had to trust, make sure you kept the letter of betrayal already written, just in case. Everyone was double-dealing. Medieval Europe was a treacherous landscape, where alliances were as fleeting as the promises made to forge them, particularly in the cutthroat world of the Italian city-states. Even families who you'd think would be reliable used blood ties as bargaining chips and then broke them the next year. An uncle could be your right hand at court while negotiating your downfall in another city's cathedral. The only thing that stuck was the memory of who had lied most spectacularly last time, and knowing full well everyone would do it again. This endless game made trust almost priceless. The constant shifting of alliances and the high stakes of medieval politics created an environment where trust was a rare commodity. If you found a genuine ally, it was less like making a friend and more like discovering buried treasure. Except, honestly, you spent most of your time checking to see if they were quietly digging up your own garden behind your back. Rulers had to be as good at reading facial expressions over dinner as they were at leading an army in the field, and always expect betrayal, even before dessert appeared. In this chaos, betrayal wasn't evil. It was a basic survival skill. As a result, betrayal was a common occurrence, and rulers had to be constantly vigilant against those they considered allies. Sometimes, your only shot at making it through another year was backstabbing your own allies before they got to you first. Medieval rulers learned to spot the point where the wind was changing and then switched banners just in time to save themselves. If you hesitated or, worst of all, acted too loyal, you ended up with nothing but regrets and, often, a one-way trip to a lonely dungeon cell. Let's talk about the real challenge: guessing who would turn first. Medieval leaders sent out spies, not just to watch the enemy, but to keep tabs on their own people. The stakes weren't just big, they were life and death, all day, every day. If you guessed wrong about a friend's loyalty, you might wake up to find your gates thrown open to an invading army, or your plans leaked to the opposition. Life at the top was a constant test of nerves, a sort of high-stakes poker, where losing meant exile, poverty, or a silent end in a candlelit back room. Courts buzzed with rumors, and every accidental glance across a banquet table could start fresh panic. People watched who sat with whom, who danced at which wedding, who left early from a feast, and every detail might signal a new plot. Even household servants got involved, bribed to carry news, hear secrets, or spread lies. Medieval rulers trusted almost no one, and for good reason. The culture of distrust made the medieval period a breeding ground for political instability and violence. Everyone lived on edge, not knowing if the stranger at their gate was bringing an offer of alliance or opening the door to a slaughter. Maps of the era feel like puzzles that shift as you stare at them. Borders changed faster than artists could draw them, and every redrawing was the result of someone's betrayal or a secret deal. Even when things looked peaceful, alliances were breaking and reforming in smoky back rooms, whispered over cups of bad wine, each side promising something different to whoever seemed strongest in that moment. There were the rare, truly ruthless survivors, people who played this game better than everyone else. The ones who didn't bother with friendship at all, who spent every waking moment managing spies, shuffling secret letters, and quietly trading promises they knew they wouldn't keep. For these medieval survivors, there were no heroes, just sharp knives and sharper minds, trying to make it to the end of the day with head and holdings intact. So next time you watch Game of Thrones and see two houses shake hands across the table, remember they've got extra daggers ready under the tablecloth. In the real medieval world, nobody slept easy, and every peace treaty had a knife hidden in the fine print. That's the kind of power game that makes fantasy drama look like child's play. And if you're wondering whether any of this was too wild for TV, well, the truth makes even the bloodiest fiction seem a little soft. Time to see just how tame Game of Thrones really was. Game of Thrones only scratched the surface of what real medieval power looked like. The political schemes, betrayals, and murders weren't even the wildest parts. Actual history was much riskier, with rulers turning marriage into their sharpest weapon, and assassins making daylight attacks for all to see. The lack of a clear and universally accepted system of succession was a major source of instability. Most royal alliances, like Margaret and Alexander's marriage, had nothing to do with love and everything to do with keeping land and power. So, which medieval plot twist would you survive? Let us know your odds.